appreciate our life as the enactment of wisdom, to appreciate a wisdom path. And one of the ways it does this is by pointing to the importance and vitality of nurturing a quiet mind, of being willing to experience a quiet mind and open awareness as a way to live in accordance with the truth of interdependence, impermanence, and no self. The way that we do this is outlined in the 16 precepts. It's very they're practical guides. They're very practical and everyday, and they're very profound. It's our vow to live in accord, once we've received the precepts, to live in accord with integrity and generosity. And it's this vow that makes working with the precepts so essential. If we really do aspire to live as real human beings, wise and mature and connected to all of life, the precepts are helpful to point us in the direction in every different, varied circumstance of our life. The precepts are faithful guides in the existential wilderness that arises moment by moment in our life. We forget that we are in a wilderness of mind, and we can easily get lost in the wilderness. We call this wilderness my life. And in this wilderness, nothing is separate from anything else. And if you've ever wandered in the wilderness, in the natural world, outside of human-built structures, you really get a sense of how everything is intertwined. Everything leans on everything else. We depend on the life of everything, and the life of everything depends on us. We share this one heart, just this one beating heart. And what comes with this realization, with our commitment, is a sense of naturally wanting to care for all of life, just as we do in the same way that we do for our eyes and ears and limbs. So this is the season that we're really turning our study to the precepts, as there are a number of people who will be receiving precepts in October. And so I wanted to begin my part of that. Now, the people who are going to be teaching the precept classes will also be giving their wisdom about how to use the precepts in the newsletter and when they lead the classes. And then I'll give mine. And the thing about the precepts is they're infinite. Anybody who has received precepts years ago knows that they continually unfold. The first of the 3 pure precepts is do no harm. Do no harm. This is an imperative that's found in many ethical teachings in addition to Buddhist teachings. It's the first commitment in the Hippocratic Oath that physicians take. Do no harm or injustice. And it's a simple statement, sounds simple enough, simply stated, but to actualize this is continual and unknowable, really, undertaking. Unknowable because the nature of our life is unknowable, is kind of vast. So I came across a quote from a Polish philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, who says, "The fact that we can never fully know reality is not a sign of the limitations of our knowledge, but the sign that reality itself is incomplete, open, an actualization of the underlying virtual process of becoming. This is deeply, deeply important to recognize for ourselves. The fact that we can never fully know reality is not a sign of the limitations of our knowledge, but the sign that reality itself is incomplete, is open, continually unfolding. This is another way of saying part of our wisdom way is don't know mind. Oh, open. We have so many habits that run us in our daily routines. And unless we're really able to pay attention and bring a questioning mind to our own behaviors, we can just continue to run the old familiar programs and not even notice the harm that they cause. And even if we're exquisitely attuned to our own minds and behavior, and we're actively devoted to living a life according to the precepts, we're still a part of a civilization that brings great harm to all living creatures, human and otherwise. We all are swept along in the collective karma that has accumulated from ages past and will continue long after you and I are gone. So, do no harm is no simple matter. And yet part of the benevolence of this way is, even though we know how difficult the prospect is, we still continue to aspire and keep in mind this commitment to do no harm. We're all swept along in collective karma that has accumulated from ages past, all the way from the genocidal settling of this country, the slave basis that still to this day maintains our material wealth in a variety of ways, all the way to the level of consumption of resources that our way of life requires. So part of do no harm would be to contemplate every day everything that's involved, that goes into whatever we consume. How do I embody a precept like do no harm? I assume that none of us ever intend to do harm. So how does it happen? We can look to the complex circumstances, the causes and conditions that are always governing our experience and our choices. Circumstances that we are aware of and circumstances that are outside of our awareness, which is mostly everything is outside of our awareness. I am reminded of today is the 9th. So yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. And I don't know if you all followed the story. I had never heard this before of what happened, that Nagasaki was bombed. But it was not intentional. It wasn't planned. It was an accident, kind of. So what happened, and this is just the general retelling of what I remember, is the plane that was carrying the bomb was supposed to bomb a town very close by that was a munitions site, that was a storehouse for massive amounts of munitions for the Japanese government. But the plane, as it was flying, was low on fuel, and they knew that unless they couldn't get to the town they were supposed to bomb, and they couldn't return to the base unless they got rid of some of the weight, and the bomb was the weight. So they found the nearest place to bomb, which happened to be a center of where people lived. It was just a residential area, and they dropped the bomb. Whew. That's our government that did that. And also there's so much contention about whether actually we even needed to do, I mean, the idea was to do good to end the war, but the Japanese were ready to surrender anyway. So even Hiroshima was not actually needed. So we carry that. We carry that the way the Germans carry the Nazi era. That's part of our karma. So that can really, we can add to our determination to do no harm, and to look at the whole project of warfare to settle conflict, and how it demonstrates an ancient response to conflict and rivalry and revenge that still in this so-called advanced technological day underlies most of our collective behaviors in relation to conflict. And we are all affected by that, not only on that massive level, but even interpersonally. The wish to do away with those who give us a problem. So our technology has advanced, but our relationship to our consciousness hasn't developed accordingly. Do no harm. And then there's the issue of racism, and the way that racism is institutionalized in how we conduct business in this society. And so many policies that are carried forward from the early days of the colonies that perpetuate the vulnerability to harm in the various communities of color that are part of this country. And it's ironic that we tout our, the fact that we are we welcome so many populations to come in, and yet that's not actually the story, such a story. So one of the ways that this has been perpetuated is redlining, or most of you probably are familiar with that. The way that certain, banks will not lend to people of color to live in certain neighborhoods. And although personally we may not be responsible for that, we pay the taxes that maintain the systems that look the other way when this happens. And our healthcare and insurance systems are rife with discrimination, direct and indirect, that cause harm to people of color, to communities of color, that those of us who are white and are privileged don't have to contend with or even be aware of. And then there are the policing policies. And I recently had a direct experience of this. I was stopped for speeding. And I have to say, I was going 33 in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, but it had been newly marked and I hadn't noticed that it was 25. But even so, I probably would have been going 33. Anyway, when I pulled over and I was waiting for the police to come to my window. And I thought, boy, if I were Black or Native American or, Pacific Islander or a person of color, I would be very tense right now because this could be the end for me, depending on how it goes. And yet, I didn't have to contend with that. It was like, whoa, this is something that I don't have to contend with. So you all are familiar with all of this. All the systems that we live in that really serve and disserve us in various ways. To say nothing of the travesty that's the prison system and the treatment of people of color by these policies, policing policies. Do no harm. And sometimes we can really consciously and specifically adhere to that. But sometimes we don't necessarily think of the whole situation. So another thing that just happened, I was talking to a friend who came across a mouse on the trail whose little legs it was dragging its legs behind it. And she thought, oh, little mouse, and she picks it up and puts it over in the grass alongside the trail. And to give it maybe the circumstances so it can heal a little bit and recover. And just at that point, she looked up and there was a hawk up in the tree. And she realized that she'd walked into the middle of the natural way of all things. And possibly by putting the mouse aside, not only caused it a lot of pain when she picked it up, but also prolonged its life for a little bit, a life of pain, which would go away if the hawk had finished its meal before she walked along the trail. So, that's the complexity of everything. We don't always know. We can intend to be compassionate and careful, and sometimes it's not exactly the best thing to do in the largest sense. So we're aware of the certain size pattern. It's one reason why in Zazen, to sit with open awareness and really look at how wide the awareness can be is part of the practice of becoming sensitized to the larger frame. So when practicing with precepts, we're always told that precepts are not absolutes. They're not thou shalt nots. Because life is complicated and our choices are often not so straightforward. We can't know the consequences of our choices. And yet we need to make them. So the precepts point us to the principle, and then also the spirit of the precepts. So the principle is to do no harm. The spirit is a warm and tender heart. The first precept is do not kill, but cherish all life. Do not kill is the principle, cherish all life is the spirit. So we hold the precepts, we hold the spirit of the precepts. This is the Bodhisattva way. Do not kill, but cherish all life. Do not kill, but cultivate and encourage life. And in our precept classes or discussions, that is always explored. So please feel quite invited to attend those when they begin in September. So they point us to the principle and then the spirit. And to remember that everything we do has consequences beyond our knowing. Some of the consequences don't show up for many years. The precepts are not absolutes. They cannot be because of the vast interdependently arising web that we're part of. How can we know the consequences of our actions? So all we can do is be responsible for thinking carefully about our choices and for being present enough to actually choose, to remember our automatic behaviors, to acknowledge our reactivity, the things that trigger us, the automatic, the habit, and we just do our best. Sometimes how we do that is we plan adequately ahead so that we can maintain the precept. For instance, wearing a mask, even though they're not so pleasant, is part of keeping the precept of doing no harm. Getting feedback or offering feedback can be a way of keeping the precept. Do no harm, but encourage life, remain connected. What are some other examples in very ordinary ways that we can be aware, plan ahead so that it leads to beneficial outcome and avoids harmful outcome? Anybody have an idea about that? Something you've noticed in your own experience? Oh, Antetsu?
I don't know that this is particularly concrete example, but whenever I know that I'm going to be part of a difficult conversation, I usually start before a conversation, before I join with, may I always speak from my heart, and may I be kind, and may my actions benefit others.
So reminding ourselves of the vow.
Yeah.
So part of this do no harm is receiving and keeping the precepts well. We don't just receive them. We have to operationalize them fully and apply them in our current situation. Do no harm for one of us might be getting rid of the car and taking a bike for transportation. For someone else, it's not possible to do that. The precept of do no harm is a guide walking along with us. Walking along the sidewalk, it can remind us not to step on the worms. Walking along the aisle in the grocery store, it can remind us of our vow to not buy anything in plastic containers. In the kitchen, it can remind us to clean and dry and sort the recyclables rather than throwing them out. So do no harm is very practical and can kind of saturate so many of our ordinary activities. And you can all come up with examples from your own experience, especially after this talk for the next day or so. You'll remember to know, you'll notice when you're doing things, oh yeah, this is about doing no harm. And it also requires us all to slow down and get present. Because if we don't, we are more likely to default to our habits and get very absorbed in our agendas. So do no harm is infinitely applicable. Do no harm can also be internal, which is to notice when you really are getting invested in inner critic and say, whoa, this is harmful, what I'm doing in my own mind to myself, and stop. And turn to appreciation, turn to encouragement. So the aspect of precepts that that runs through all of them is that we recognize that we are all individual emanations
Mushin just got a new computer, and a little earlier today during the book club, she lost connection to the internet, which was the first time ever, she said. So this may now be the second time. We'll see. Yeah, she lost it. So what we could do while we wait for her to come back is I'll share my screen and we can chant Shanti Deva's Way of the Bodhisattva.